The silence stretched across the briefing room like a taut wire, broken only by the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of F-35s taxiing on the tarmac outside. Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Reaper, Volkov leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying the dossier spread before him with the kind of skeptical interest reserved for fairy tales and government promises. The photograph clipped to the manila folder showed a woman in her early 30s, sharp green eyes beneath perfectly arched brows, auburn hair pulled back in military regulation. Her dress blues displayed an impressive array of ribbons, but what caught Reaper's attention wasn't the decorations. It was the subtle defiance in her expression, as if she'd grown accustomed to being underestimated. Phoenix Dynamics, he muttered, reading the corporate letterhead aloud. Never heard of them. Staff Sergeant Torres, hunched over his laptop, looked up with raised eyebrows. Private military contractor. Big money, bigger toys. They've been acquiring former military assets, aircraft, personnel, weapons systems. Word is their CEO has more money than God and twice the attitude. The mystery deepened as Reaper flipped through the pages. Captain Vesper Nightingale Blackwood, former Air Force, flew everything from A-10 Warthogs to experimental stealth fighters before her discharge 3 years prior. Her service record read like a greatest hits album of air combat. 17 confirmed kills, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars. But then nothing. Radio silence. Until yesterday, when Phoenix Dynamics had contacted JSOC with an offer that sounded too good to be true. She wants to what? Colonel Martinez had demanded when the secure line crackled to life from their forward operating base in Syria. Provide close air support for the Aleppo extraction, Reaper had explained, still processing the audacity himself. Says she's got hardware we haven't seen and skills we need. The laughter from the other end was sharp, cutting. Some billionaire's pet pilot thinks she can run with the big dogs. Tell her thanks but no thanks. We've got real military handling this. But now, staring at Nightingale's photograph, Reaper felt an uncomfortable twist in his gut. Something about her file didn't add up. Elite pilots didn't just disappear into the private sector without reason. The gaps in her service record suggested classified operations, the kind that left scars on souls rather than skin. Her discharge papers were heavily redacted, but one detail stood out: voluntary separation after psychological evaluation. Post-traumatic stress, the clinical language suggested. But Reaper had seen broken pilots before, and this woman's eyes held something different. Not defeat, determination. Not fear, fury held in perfect check. Outside, another fighter screamed overhead, its engines Doppler shifting from roar to whisper. Reaper closed the folder, decision crystallizing. Tomorrow's mission would determine whether Nightingale was salvation or just another rich person's fantasy. Either way, he was about to find out what happened when money tried to buy its way into war. The morning sun painted the Syrian desert in shades of amber and rust as Alpha Team gathered around their Humvees, checking weapons and comms gear with the methodical precision of men who knew that carelessness killed. The extraction point lay 60 clicks northeast, a bombed-out hospital where 3 American journalists had been trapped for 18 hours, surrounded by hostile forces and running out of time. It should have been a straightforward operation. Fast insertion, overwhelming firepower, rapid extraction. Should have been. Reaper adjusted his tactical vest, feeling the familiar weight of ceramic plates against his chest. 23 years in special operations had taught him that should have been were the 2 most dangerous words in the military lexicon. He glanced at his watch. 6:47 hours. Their mysterious benefactor was late. "Sir," Torres called from beside their communications array, one hand pressed to his earpiece. "We've got incoming aircraft, bearing 270 distance. Christ, she's moving fast." The sound reached them before the visual, a deep, throaty rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath their boots. Not the high whine of a jet engine, but something lower, more primal. Reaper raised his binoculars, scanning the horizon until he found it, a dark speck growing larger against the cloudless sky. "What the hell is that?" Sergeant First Class Bulldog Ramirez muttered, shading his eyes against the glare. As the aircraft drew closer, its unusual configuration became apparent. Twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, distinctive forward-swept wings, and a profile that didn't match anything in Reaper's considerable mental database of military hardware. It looked like someone had crossed a A-10 Thunderbolt with a stealth fighter and added a healthy dose of science fiction. The radio crackled. "Ground Team Alpha, this is Phoenix 1 requesting permission to enter your airspace. I believe you gentlemen are expecting me." The voice was professional, controlled, with just a hint of southern drawl that somehow made it more unsettling. Reaper keyed his mic. "Phoenix 1, Alpha Actual. You're cleared for approach, but I want to see you on the ground for briefing before we move out." "Copy that, Alpha Actual. Be advised I'm coming in hot and heavy. My bird's loaded for bear, and she doesn't like to take things slow." The aircraft, whatever it was, banked sharply to the left, bleeding altitude and speed in a manner that defied conventional aerodynamics. Landing gear deployed with mechanical precision as it lined up with the makeshift strip they'd cleared earlier. The touchdown was perfect. Not a bounce, not a wobble, just smooth contact with the earth that spoke of thousands of hours in the cockpit. As the engine spooled down, the canopy began to rise with a hydraulic hiss. Reaper found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't explain why. The pilot who emerged wore a flight suit that was clearly military in cut but bore no national markings, no squadron patches. Just a single emblem over the left breast, a stylized phoenix rising from flames, rendered in gold thread against black fabric. She pulled off her helmet, shaking out auburn hair that caught the morning light like burnished copper. Even at 50 meters, her movements spoke of deadly competence. The morning air carried the acrid scent of jet fuel and hot metal as Captain Vesper Blackwood approached their position with measured strides. Up close, Reaper could see the details that the photograph had missed. The slight lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting through helmet visors. The unconscious way she kept her right hand near her sidearm. The controlled stillness that marked someone accustomed to violence. Most telling was her gaze. It swept their perimeter in a tactical assessment before focusing on him with laser intensity. "Colonel Volkov, I presume." Her voice carried the same controlled authority he'd heard over the radio, but now he caught nuances that spoke of education and breeding carefully tempered with military discipline. "Captain Blackwood, Phoenix Dynamics, thank you for accepting our assistance." Reaper extended his hand, nodding her firm grip, and the calluses that marked someone who still pulled her own triggers. "Assistance is a generous term, Captain. What I'm hearing is that some private contractor thinks she can waltz into our AO and run close air support like it's a video game." Something flickered behind her green eyes, not anger but amusement. "I understand your skepticism. In your position, I'd feel the same way. May I ask about your close air support package for today's mission?" Torres answered before Reaper could respond. "2 F-16s out of Incirlik, weapons tight until we paint targets. Standard loadout, couple of JDAMs, some Hellfires." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Good aircraft. Capable pilots, I'm sure. But tell me, Colonel, what happens when those F-16s run Winchester? How long before they can return to station after a fuel stop?" The question hit closer to home than Reaper cared to admit. Their air support would be limited by fuel and weapons load, with significant gaps in coverage during the extraction phase. It was the kind of operational vulnerability that kept commanders awake at night. "That's classified information," he replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "Of course it is, but I'm betting it's somewhere around 45 minutes minimum, probably closer to an hour by the time they refuel and rearm. During a hot extraction, Colonel, 45 minutes might as well be 45 years." She gestured toward her aircraft. My bird carries enough fuel for 6 hours of loiter time and enough ordnance to level a city block. More importantly, I don't answer to any air traffic control or operational commanders who might develop cold feet when things get complicated. Bulldog spat tobacco juice into the sand. So, what makes you think you're better than Air Force pilots with years of combat experience? The question hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Blackwood studied Bulldog for a long moment, then smiled. Not the polite, professional expression she'd worn since arriving, but something sharper. I don't think I'm better, Sergeant. I know I am. But you don't have to take my word for it. Check your tactical frequency in about 30 seconds. She pressed something on her wrist-mounted device. Almost immediately, Reaper's radio erupted with chatter. The radio chatter that filled the airwaves sent ice through Reaper's veins, despite the desert heat. Multiple call signs, all reporting the same impossible situation. Hostile aircraft were painting them with targeting radar from positions that shouldn't have existed. F-16s from Incirlik were declaring defensive postures, requesting immediate vectoring to safe zones. Surface-to-air missile batteries that intelligence had sworn were neutralized were suddenly broadcasting acquisition tones across military frequencies. What the hell, Torres started, but Blackwood raised a hand for silence. Phoenix control to all frequencies, execute umbrella protocol, she spoke into her comm device. All targeting systems to standby, defensive postures only. The radio chatter stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The desert fell silent except for wind across sand and the distant tick of cooling aircraft metal. Reaper stared at the woman before him, mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same unsettling conclusion. That was you, not a question, a statement heavy with implications he didn't like. Electronic warfare suite, Blackwood confirmed calmly. My aircraft carries some interesting toys. What your people just experienced was a carefully orchestrated demonstration, spoofed radar signatures, false targeting data, communications jamming selectively applied. Nothing dangerous, just educational. You jammed military frequencies, Tor's voice cracked with outrage. That's an act of war. No, Sergeant, that's a job interview. Her green eyes found Reaper's again. Your conventional air support just proved they can be neutralized by systems that have been available on the black market for years. My bird, on the other hand, carries countermeasures that most nations can't afford and some can't even comprehend. The question isn't whether I'm better than Air Force pilots. It's whether you want someone watching your six who can fight back when the electromagnetic spectrum turns hostile. Reaper felt the familiar weight of command decisions pressing down on him. Every instinct screamed that trusting an unknown quantity was dangerous, but the demonstration had shaken him more than he cared to admit. If Blackwood could spoof their own systems so easily, what could she do to their enemies? Impressive party trick, he said finally. But electronic warfare doesn't mean squat if you can't put ordnance on target when it matters. Fair point. She glanced at her watch. Your mission timeline has you wheels up in 20 minutes. I suggest we conduct a more practical demonstration en route. There's an abandoned radio tower about 15 clicks north of here. Perfect target for a little live fire exercise. Bulldog laughed harshly. Lady, that tower's been used for target practice by every pilot in theater. There's nothing left but scrap metal and concrete. Then I'll hit the scrap metal. The confidence in her voice was absolute, unshakable. But I'll bet you dinner at the finest restaurant in whatever city you call home that I can put a round through something specific enough to make you believe. The challenge hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down in some medieval court. Reaper studied her face, looking for tells, for signs of the uncertainty or bravado that marked amateurs playing at war. He found neither. What he saw instead was the quiet certainty of someone who had looked death in the eye so many times they'd become old friends. The decision crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. They were heading into hostile territory with journalists' lives hanging in the balance. In 6 hours, when the F-16s were running on fumes and the enemy was closing in, would he rather have conventional support or this enigmatic woman with her mysterious aircraft and unsettling confidence? "You've got yourself a deal, Captain," he said. "But if this goes sideways, if you put my men at risk with your showboating—" "Then you'll have my full permission to shoot me down yourself," she replied without hesitation. "But, Colonel, you won't need to." 20 minutes later, the convoy rolled north through terrain that looked like Mars had a fight with hell and lost. Reaper rode in the lead Humvee, eyes fixed on the sky where Blackwood's aircraft paced them at low altitude. The bird moved with predatory grace, wings adjusting constantly to air currents in micro-movements that spoke of fly-by-wire systems more advanced than anything he'd seen on military hardware. "Phoenix 1, Alpha Actual," he spoke into his headset. "We've got visual on the target area. Tower remnants bearing 045, range approximately 2 clicks. Copy Alpha Actual. I have the target. Stand by for demonstration." Through his binoculars, Reaper could see the twisted remains of what had once been a communication tower. Years of bombing runs and artillery strikes had reduced it to a skeleton of bent steel and concrete chunks. The largest intact piece was a section of latticed metal framework, maybe 3 meters tall and riddled with holes from countless training exercises. "Phoenix 1, what exactly are you planning to?" His question was cut short by a sound unlike anything he'd experienced in 2 decades of military service. Not the sharp crack of conventional ordnance, not the whoosh of missiles, something else entirely. The air itself seemed to tear apart with a noise that was part thunder, part screaming wind. Where the tower remnant had stood, a perfect circle of glass now gleamed in the desert sand. The metal framework was gone, not destroyed but absent, as if it had never existed. The surrounding concrete was untouched, unmarked by blast or heat, just gone. "Jesus Christ," Bulldog whispered from the gunner's position. "What the hell kind of weapon was that?" Reaper's radio crackled. "Phoenix 1 to Alpha Actual. Directed energy weapon, Colonel. Surgical precision, minimal collateral damage, and completely silent to acoustic sensors. The metal has been reduced to constituent atoms, no explosive residue, no fragmentation pattern. Your enemy won't even know they're under attack until their equipment simply stops existing." The implications hit Reaper like physical blows. A weapon that could eliminate targets without trace, without warning, without the signature that marked conventional ordnance. In the right hands, it was the perfect surgical instrument. In the wrong hands, it was something from nightmares. "Captain," he said carefully, "I need to know who you really work for." The pause stretched long enough that he wondered if she'd heard him. When her voice came back, it carried undertones he couldn't quite identify. "I work for Phoenix Dynamics, Colonel, but Phoenix Dynamics works for people who understand that some fights can't be won with conventional thinking. Today, we work for 3 journalists who deserve to go home to their families. Tomorrow," another pause, "tomorrow we'll see who needs us most." The convoy resumed its northward progression, but the atmosphere had changed. Reaper's men rode in contemplative silence, processing what they'd witnessed. In the distance, Blackwood's aircraft continued its patient patrol, no longer just another piece of military hardware but something far more complex and potentially dangerous. As they approached the operational area, Reaper found himself wondering if he just witnessed the future of warfare or made a deal with the devil. The distinction, he was beginning to suspect, might be irrelevant. The radio came alive with professional chatter as they entered the final approach to the target zone. Intelligence updates flowed in steady streams. Hostile positions, civilian locations, updated weather data. But underneath the familiar rhythm of military communications, Reaper detected tension that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. Word of their mysterious contractor was spreading through channels, generating curiosity and concern in equal measure. "Alpha Actual, this is Overwatch 6, crackled the voice of Colonel Martinez from the Tactical Operations Center. "I'm seeing unusual aircraft in your operational area. Please confirm your air support package." Reaper keyed his mic, choosing words carefully. "Overwatch 6, we have additional close air support assets courtesy of private contractor Phoenix Dynamics. Aircraft is currently providing reconnaissance and standby fire support." The pause that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, long enough for Reaper to count heartbeats. "Alpha Actual, be advised that Phoenix Dynamics is not an approved contractor for this operational theater. You are directed to Overwatch 6, Phoenix 1. Blackwood's voice cut across the frequency with polite authority. "I'm transmitting authorization codes now. You'll find everything is properly documented through appropriate channels." Another pause, this one longer. When Martinez came back online, his tone had shifted from commanding to merely annoyed. "Authorization codes confirmed, Phoenix 1. Be advised that all weapons employment requires prior approval from this station." "Understood, Overwatch 6. Phoenix 1 will operate under standard rules of engagement." Reaper caught the subtle emphasis on standard and wondered what non-standard rules might apply to someone with Blackwood's capabilities. The question became academic as they crested a low ridge, and the target area spread below them like a tactical planning map made real. The hospital complex sat in a shallow valley, its modern architecture incongruous against the ancient landscape. What had once been a symbol of healing now bore the scars of months-long siege. Blast damage, collapsed sections, vehicles burned to skeletal remains. Through binoculars, Reaper could see muzzle flashes from windows and rooftops, defenders still fighting, still holding their ground despite overwhelming odds. "Alpha Actual, Phoenix 1. I'm seeing approximately 40 hostile combatants in fixed positions around the complex. Heavy weapons emplacements on the north and east sides, probable mortar position in the parking structure. Your people are holed up in the southwest corner, second floor. They've got good fields of fire, but they're running low on ammunition." The tactical assessment was delivered with clinical precision, but Reaper heard something else in her voice, personal investment that went beyond professional obligation. "How can you be so specific about their ammunition status?" "Because I've been monitoring their radio traffic for the past 6 hours. Lisa Chen, photographer for National Geographic, Marcus Webb and Jennifer Santos from Reuters. They've been sending situation reports every 30 minutes, hoping someone was listening. Someone was." The simple statement carried weight that settled in Reaper's chest like cold stone. While his team had been planning and preparing, while military bureaucracy had ground through authorization procedures, Blackwood had been listening to civilians beg for rescue. The knowledge shaped his next words. "Phoenix 1, what do you need from us?" "Time, mostly. I can clear the immediate threats, but extraction will require ground assets. I'd estimate 15 minutes to neutralize external positions, then you'll have a window to reach the building." Torres looked up from his communications array. "Sir, F-16s are checking in. They're requesting target assignments." Reaper found himself at one of those decision points that would define careers and haunt dreams. Conventional wisdom said use proven assets, established procedures, familiar weapons. But conventional wisdom hadn't been monitoring civilian radio frequencies for 6 hours. "Phoenix 1, you have tactical command of air support. F-16s will provide overwatch and backup." "Copy, Alpha Actual. Beginning attack run in 60 seconds. Recommend your vehicles find defilade positions. This might get loud." The aircraft above them banked sharply, transforming from patient sentinel to hunting predator in the space of heartbeats. What followed would become the stuff of legend in certain circles, though few would ever believe the full truth. The attack began not with explosions but with silence. The first indication of Blackwood's engagement was the sudden cessation of incoming fire from the hospital complex. Hostile muzzle flashes simply stopped, one by one, as if invisible fingers were snuffing candles. Through his binoculars, Reaper watched enemy positions fall silent without visible cause, no blast effects, no smoke trails, just sudden, complete silence. Phoenix 1 Alpha Actual. I'm not seeing any ordnance impacts. What's your weapon status? Directed energy systems, Colonel. I'm using precise applications to neutralize weapons without harming personnel. The idea is to encourage retreat rather than create martyrs. As if responding to her words, figures began emerging from defensive positions with hands raised, moving away from the complex in obvious retreat. Some ran, others walked with the careful deliberation of people who'd seen enough war to recognize when the odds had shifted beyond recovery. My God, Tor's breathed, she's making them surrender without killing them. But not all the defenders were ready to quit. A mortar tube coughed from the parking structure, sending high explosive rounds toward the hospital in desperate final salvos. Blackwood's response was immediate and devastating. The entire upper level of the parking structure simply ceased to exist, leaving the lower floor intact but removing the weapons platform with surgical precision. Phoenix 1 to Alpha Actual, pathway is clear. Recommend immediate advance to extract package. Be advised, you'll have approximately 20 minutes before reinforcements arrive from the east. The convoy rolled forward into ground still settling from unnatural warfare. As they approached the hospital, Reaper could see evidence of Blackwood's work. Weapons that had been cleanly severed at crucial points, vehicle engines that had stopped running without visible damage, communications equipment that sparked and smoked from internal failures. Tors, get me a comm check with our people inside. Alpha Actual, this is Webb. We heard the shooting stop. Are you friendlies? That's affirmative. We're here to take you home. Prepare for immediate extraction. As his team established security and began extraction procedures, Reaper looked up to see Blackwood's aircraft maintaining overwatch with patient precision. The morning sun had climbed higher, painting the desert in harsh light that exposed every detail of the surgical violence she'd inflicted. No bodies, minimal structural damage, but complete tactical victory achieved through means that redefined his understanding of warfare. His radio crackled. Phoenix 1 to Alpha Actual. You've got movement from multiple vectors. Looks like someone called for reinforcements. The game, apparently, was just beginning. The reinforcements came from 3 directions at once, coordinated response that spoke of professional military training rather than militia enthusiasm. Reaper watched through binoculars as dust clouds marked their approach, vehicles moving with tactical spacing, following terrain features that would minimize exposure to air attack. Someone on the other side knew what they were doing. Alpha Actual Phoenix 1. Count approximately 60 hostiles in 12 vehicles, approaching from northeast, east, and southeast. Mixed small arms and crew-served weapons, at least 2 technical vehicles with mounted recoilless rifles. They're moving to surround your position. Inside the hospital, his team was making good progress with the extraction. The 3 journalists were mobile but showing signs of prolonged stress, dehydration, exhaustion, the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many hours wondering if rescue would come. They'd need medical evaluation, but they'd live to file their stories. Phoenix 1, what's your assessment of our tactical situation? Honestly, Colonel, not great. They're using classic envelopment tactics, and they've got more firepower than your ground team can handle in open terrain. The F-16s could help, but danger-close support gets complicated when friendlies and hostiles are mixed together. Reaper felt the familiar weight of command decisions. His team was good, possibly the best, but they were outnumbered and outgunned in terrain that offered limited defensive options. The smart play was to call for immediate extraction via helicopter, but the nearest aviation assets were 40 minutes out. Options, Captain. I can buy you time, but it's going to require trust on your part. I need to operate in closer proximity to your position than standard safety protocols recommend. Are you comfortable with that? The question carried implications that went beyond tactical considerations. She was asking him to trust not just her skills, but her judgment, her commitment to keeping his people alive. It was the kind of trust that took months to build between conventional military units. How close are we talking? Close enough that you'll feel the heat from my engines when I make attack runs. Close enough that if I make a mistake, we all pay for it together. Through the hospital windows, Reaper could see the approaching dust clouds growing larger. His team was almost ready to move, but they'd need covering fire to reach their vehicles, and conventional air support couldn't provide it without risking friendly fire incidents. "Do it," he said, "but Captain, don't make any mistakes." Copy, Alpha Actual. Beginning close support in 30 seconds. Recommend your people find solid cover and stay there until I give the all-clear. What followed redefined Reaper's understanding of close air support. Blackwood's aircraft dove toward the approaching hostiles with predatory precision, engines screaming in harmonics that seemed to shake the earth itself. Her weapons spoke in languages of light and energy, reaching out to touch vehicles and weapons with surgical accuracy. But this time, she wasn't encouraging retreat. This time, she was making statements about the consequences of threatening American civilians. Vehicle engines exploded into superheated metal fragments. Weapon systems simply ceased to function as their electronic components failed in cascades of sparks and smoke. Communications equipment broadcast only static as precisely applied electromagnetic pulses reduced complex electronics to expensive paperweights. The enemy response was immediate and desperate. Small arms fire reached toward her aircraft in futile streams of tracer rounds that fell short like dying meteors. One of the technical vehicles managed to fire its recoilless rifle, the round passing close enough to her starboard wing that Reaper could see the aircraft shudder from the pressure wave. Blackwood's reaction was instantaneous. The technical vehicle and its crew simply vanished in a flash of coherent light that left only glass where metal had been. "Jesus," Bulldog whispered from his position in the hospital corridor. "She just vaporized them." The psychological effect on the remaining attackers was immediate. Vehicles that had been advancing in coordinated assault began breaking formation, some fleeing outright while others sought cover behind terrain features. But Blackwood wasn't finished. Her aircraft climbed and banked, acquiring new targets with mechanical precision. Alpha Actual, Phoenix 1. Hostile forces are in full retreat. You've got a clear corridor to the south for approximately 15 minutes before regrouping. Recommend immediate exfiltration. As his team loaded the journalists into their vehicles and prepared to move, Reaper found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about modern warfare. The woman flying overhead had just broken the back of a coordinated attack, using weapons and tactics that seemed drawn from science fiction, all while maintaining the clinical precision of a surgeon. But more than that, she'd done it to save 3 people she'd never met, civilians whose only crime was trying to tell the world what was happening in this forgotten corner of Syria. The thought settled in his chest with uncomfortable weight as the convoy began its withdrawal through terrain painted with the debris of her lethal artistry. The extraction route took them through a valley that nature had carved with geological patience and human conflict had scarred with more recent violence. Abandoned vehicles littered the roadside, some destroyed by conventional ordnance, others bearing the strange, clean damage that marked Blackwood's weapons. The contrast between old and new warfare was written in twisted metal and scattered glass. Alpha Actual, Phoenix 1. Be advised, I'm tracking additional movement from the north. Appears to be a recovery convoy, possibly attempting to retrieve surviving personnel from the earlier engagement. Reaper checked his GPS display. They were still 20 clicks from the extraction point where helicopters would take the journalists to safety. 20 clicks of open terrain with limited cover, and an unknown number of hostiles somewhere ahead and behind. Can you identify the threat level? Negative on precise count, but I'm seeing at least 6 vehicles and what appears to be air defense assets. They're setting up in defensive positions along your planned route. Someone's been monitoring our communications. The possibility of compromised communication sent ice through Reaper's veins. If the enemy was listening to their tactical frequencies, every plan and position was potentially known. But more troubling was the implication that they were dealing with sophisticated opposition, not the ragtag militia forces that populated most intelligence briefings. Phoenix 1, can your systems provide communication security? Already on it, Colonel. I'm broadcasting white noise on standard military frequencies and establishing encrypted channels for our use. But the fact that they anticipated your route suggests either very good intelligence or very lucky guessing. Tors, monitoring multiple radio frequencies from the rear vehicle, suddenly looked up with alarm. Sir, I'm getting chatter from command. Sounds like our extraction helicopters are encountering mechanical problems. They're running 30 minutes behind schedule. 30 minutes. In tactical terms, 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours when you're sitting in hostile territory with civilians to protect and unknown enemies converging on your position. Reaper felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with operations spinning beyond control. Phoenix 1, we need to reach the extraction point and establish a defensive perimeter. How long can you maintain air support? As long as necessary, Colonel. But I should mention, I'm starting to get some attention from higher up the food chain. My activities today are generating interest in places that prefer their operations to remain quiet. Before Reaper could ask what that meant, his radio exploded with urgent traffic. All stations, this is Overwatch 6. Be advised, Syrian air defense networks have activated across the region. Multiple SAM sites are painting aircraft with targeting radar. All air assets are directed to maintain defensive postures until threat assessment is complete. The implications hit Reaper like physical blows. If Syrian air defenses were active, conventional air support would be forced to withdraw to safe zones. The F-16s that had been providing Overwatch were already climbing to higher altitudes, moving beyond the engagement envelope of surface-to-air missiles. In minutes, his team would be alone on the ground with only Blackwood's mysterious aircraft for protection. Phoenix 1, what's your status regarding air defense threats? The pause that followed lasted long enough for him to count heartbeats. When her voice returned, it carried undertones that made his skin crawl. Alpha Actual, Syrian air defenses are not a concern for my aircraft, but the fact that they've been activated suggests someone wants to clear the airspace of American assets. The question is why? As if summoned by her words, new contacts appeared on their tactical displays, aircraft approaching from the west at high speed. Not the familiar signatures of American or Allied planes, but something else. Something that belonged to people with different flags and very different intentions regarding American civilians in Syrian territory. The trap, Reaper realized, was closing with mechanical precision, and they were running out of room to maneuver. The approaching aircraft resolved into a formation that made Reaper's blood turn to slush in his veins. 4 Su-35 flankers bearing Russian Air Force markings, flying in combat spread at medium altitude. Professional pilots, modern aircraft, air-to-air missiles that could reach out and kill from distances that turned dogfights into mathematical equations rather than aerial ballet. Phoenix 1 Alpha Actual. I'm seeing Russian fast movers inbound bearing 270. What are your intentions? The silence that followed stretched long enough for Reaper to wonder if she was still there. When Blackwood's voice returned, it carried a quality he hadn't heard before, not uncertainty, but the careful consideration of someone choosing between bad options and worse ones. Alpha Actual, those aircraft are operating under diplomatic protocols that don't technically allow them to engage American assets. But they're carrying enough ordnance to level this valley if someone decides that protocols are suggestions rather than rules. Through his binoculars, Reaper could see the Russian formation adjusting course to intercept their position. The lead aircraft was already beginning to descend, a predatory movement that suggested someone had made decisions about how this day was going to end. Phoenix 1, are you able to engage? Another pause, shorter this time. Colonel, engaging Russian military aircraft over Syrian airspace would represent an escalation that neither of our governments want to explain to their respective populations. But protecting American civilians from what could be interpreted as an unfortunate targeting error. The tone shifted, became something sharper. That falls into different categories entirely. His radio crackled with new traffic. Phoenix 1, this is Russian flight Medved 11. You are operating in restricted airspace without authorization. Depart immediately or face consequences. Blackwood's response was delivered in fluent Russian, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she'd had similar conversations before. Reaper's Russian was limited, but he caught enough to understand that she was declining their suggestion with language that was both diplomatic and unmistakably final. The lead Su-35 banked sharply, bringing its nose around to acquire a firing solution on Blackwood's aircraft. The gesture was unmistakable, a visual threat that carried all the subtlety of a loaded gun pointed at someone's head. What happened next would be analyzed by intelligence agencies for months. Blackwood's aircraft climbed at an angle that should have been impossible for its apparent configuration, accelerating beyond what conventional engines should have been able to produce. The Russian formation found itself pursuing a target that was suddenly operating in 3 dimensions, while they were limited to conventional flight profiles. Medved 11, Phoenix 1, gentlemen, you're embarrassing yourselves. The Russian response was immediate and predictable. Air-to-air missiles streaked toward Blackwood's position in streams of white smoke and deadly intent. But her aircraft had already moved, not with the desperate maneuvering of conventional evasion, but with the fluid grace of something that viewed physics as suggestions rather than laws. The missiles, deprived of their target, began seeking new heat sources. 2 found each other in mutual annihilation that painted the sky in orange flowers of destruction. The other 2, confused by electronic countermeasures that turned their guidance systems into expensive noise generators, simply fell earthward like very expensive stones. Blackwood's counterattack was surgical in its precision. Her weapons reached out to touch each Su-35 with energy that didn't destroy so much as disable. Electronics failed in cascades of sparks.